A repository is basically kind of like a file folder. It just contains all your files, all your XML that's listed out here. Now, your XML in turn, as we've said, are mainly text files. Everything in Salesforce is broken down into an XML file that can be compared against each other. When you use a repository, it has to be the source of truth for everything, right? So in these two examples, if we have Salesforce as our source of truth, that means the production org, you would make changes to configuration here. So let's say if you change a flow. After you change your flow, you would write that to your repository as a backup, right? So the main purposes of your repository would be for backup. You could have some version control in there because, you know, the backup would basically chart all your changes over time. You could see your changes, everything else like that. But the repository is not being used to drive changes to Salesforce. Alternatively, if you are using the repository as your source of truth, this is what happens. Purpose of using the repository as your source of truth then largely becomes that instead of sandboxes writing directly to production org, they would have to commit everything to the repository instead. This way, you could have an actual process of reviewing changes, and then the repository would actually act as kind of your master copy of everything. Salesforce, in turn, would basically be a copy of whatever is in your repository. There's different advantages to it. It's a little more complicated to set up, but this is the most important thing to remember. What you use on a day-to-day basis in Salesforce would only be a copy of what's in the repository because this is your source of truth that is being committed to. This is the source of truth that everything else is writing to, right? Think of it this way. If we have a book, we're using our book. Now, what is our source of truth? Do we go and write in the margins here in the book? You know, are we highlighting in our book here? Are we making changes to the pages of our book? Over time, those changes, everything else like that, it just becomes a little too unwieldy, right? It's not bad in the short term, and it's not bad if you're, studying or cramming for a test or something like that. But what if we had a system whereby the actual publisher's master file was actually your source of truth? What you could do then is, whenever this book gets messed up, whenever anything bad happens to this book, you can instead copy from the publisher and get all this stuff taken away. Basically, you will always have a master version of what it's supposed to look like with the publisher here. So obviously, if you're, let's take the example that this is a textbook, right? If anything is ever wrong in the textbook, you can republish from the master and it would be corrected. And again, using the example of a textbook, if there's facts that have changed in the textbook, let's say, a country no longer exists, right? That would be a change. Instead of making the change in the textbook, which would be lost with every subsequent printing of the textbook, we would need to instead make the change to the published master. This way, every copy of the textbook that follows after that would have the fact that, we would have a country that no longer exists. Even though using the book itself as your source of truth is not bad for the short term, for smaller projects, everything else like that. The more complicated changes you have, you need to have the source of truth as something external to the book itself. So that's really the key difference between using your Salesforce org as your source of truth, good enough, versus your repository here. Okay, I hope this clarifies a few things.